Hey everybody, welcome to whatever it is, day something of the quarantine. Everybody's stuck inside or pretty close to it. I'm hoping that before long we're not like putting scratch marks on the walls and talking about, year 5 of our captivity or whatever. I thought it might be a good excuse for all of you writers out there and creative types, storytellers, screenwriters, etc. Just to spend a little bit of time talking about what I'm going to call writing keys. I'm hoping to do a short series of like 10-minute videos, just talking about some of the aspects of writing that get overlooked a little bit in some of the teaching things. So certain techniques that have the power to make writing more fun and more interesting, more fascinating, but don't often get taught very much in seminars and online classes, etc. So this one is actually going to be on characterization and specifically the power of masks. So what I consider one of the primary ways of creating characters. Its use goes back for quite a while, and it's only one of many elements, of course. You guys are probably familiar with the posters. If you went to public school at some point in your middle school or junior high school years, you probably had a poster that had the 5 elements of story listed on it. And the 5 elements would have been probably in this order: characterization, plot, setting, theme, style. Sometimes they put voice on there. And when I teach the one-year adventure novel, I actually talk about those and then point out that they're really words and tools of analysis, and shift over to what I call the 5 creative elements of story, which are the ones that we go into in the one-year adventure novel program. Someone to care about, something to want, something to dread, something to suffer, and something to learn. Now, the analytical 5, though, are certainly worth talking about in terms of storytelling. In fact, one of the things I want to do today, before this video is over, is I just want to read the first page from the Book of the Dun Cow by Walter Wangerin Jr. Won the National Book Award back in, I think, 1978. And it's an excellent illustration of probably 10 different great writing techniques. That's why it won the National Book Award. It's because he's a fabulous writer. But one technique in particular I want to point out. So today I'm going to concentrate on characterization in the next like 5 or 6 minutes. And I want to point out one principle that's so common. Once you see it pointed out, you're going to realize you've been seeing it all the time, on the news and in Netflix and in books. You've probably even seen it in your own thought processes, perhaps without noticing it as a writing technique. But before I explain it, I want to read the first page of the Book of the Dun Cow, and maybe as an illustration, the technique will make more sense in context. So chapter 1 of the Book of the Dun Cow is called How Mundo Canny Came to Live with Chanticleer. In the middle of the night, somebody began to cry outside of Chanticleer's coop. If it had been but a few sprinkled tears with nothing more than a moan or two, Chanticleer would probably not have minded. But this crying was more than a gentle moan. By each dark hour of the night it grew. It became a decided wail, and after that it became a definite howl. And howling, particularly at the door of his coop and in the middle of the night, howling Chanticleer minded very much. Chanticleer the rooster had trouble sleeping anyway, though this was no one's fault but his own. He snored. Well, Chanticleer called it a snore, and everyone else who lived in his coop called it a snore too, but everybody else knew, secretly, that it was a positive crow. And this is the way that it went. As dusk fell, the whole company of the coop would take to their roosts, tuck their heads deep into their neck and shoulder feathers, ruffle, cluck, and fall asleep, Chanticleer among them. For the space of several hours, silence and contentment would fill the coop, and sleep was good. But then Chanticleer would begin to dream, and with his dream he would set up such a sudden, loud, and raucous snoring that every living soul in the neighborhood of the coop would wake up. Immediately they all had a job to do. They had to pretend that they were still asleep, because it was Chanticleer's snore, after all. When his snores came close to the sound of thunder, then Chanticleer woke up too, with a headache. And he wouldn't pretend. He was awake and he was angry about it. He'd cock his eye angrily at this creature and that, looking for guilt, waiting until one poor soul couldn't stand it any longer, and moved. You! Chanticleer would cry, and the hen would wilt, moving very much all of a sudden. Ah ha ha! You! The rooster's comb would stand up like a fan on the top of his head. He would flut down and strut up to the sad hen and fix her with a one-eyed stare from the side of his rooster head. You! Sleep on my straw, eat my grain, hide from the wind and dry from the rain, and how do you repay my great goodness to you? You woke me. How do you like that? And what's more, you woke me up. Then Chanticleer would make a noise which he considered to be something better than a snore. It was a true crow, and it entered the shivering hen's ear with such a force that she wouldn't sleep for the rest of the night. Back to his perch the rooster would grump, twisting and turning and mumbling his perturbation. He did most certainly despise to be awakened from his dreams. But finally he would nod and dream again. Okay, if you missed it, that was the opening page from the Book of the Dun Cow by Walter Wangerin Jr. And my point in reading that is that it is an excellent illustration of, as I said, many things, but one thing in particular. And you can point it out by asking the question, what do you think of Chanticleer at this point? If you've read the book, you may have a different picture of him, hopefully. But at this point, if you've never read it, if you just heard that, what are you thinking of him? I've asked that question before, and inevitably people think, well, he's grumpy. Of course he is. That's how he's depicted, right? He's grumpy. Yeah, he has a reason, but he's probably too grumpy, right? Well, that grumpiness and his snoring is a setup. It is, in effect, a mask that is concealing a truer version of himself. So the mask is actually there in the story so that it can be peeled away. And that is the principle of characterization that I want to point out. It's that, from the first place, all of us as human beings wear masks pretty much all the time. And we don't take off those masks unless we're around someone we trust. And then, even then, we will take off various masks or various layers of masks. And the reason is not that we're all trying to be dishonest. It's that none of us wants to be completely vulnerable because we've been hurt before. It's too dangerous in the world to go around being completely yourself all the time around everybody. So we have to put on kind of identities depending on the group that we're in. I'm not advocating this. I'm saying you are a little different person walking in to buy a new car than you are when you're completely at home alone talking to your spouse or parents or kids or whatever. You put that mask on because you're not quite sure you trust the people who want to sell you the car. And that we do that all the time, right? So what happens is when we relax and we're around people we trust, the masks start to come off. Or in the situation of just making something up, if you're working with kind of hardened teens or something, kids who are having a hard time in life and they don't trust you, you're a guidance counselor or whatever, and they might be described as having a kind of hard outer shell, right? And at some point in the story, the shell will break and the student or the kid will kind of be themselves, be a little more vulnerable, right? We call that letting you in or letting someone else in, and it's basically self-revelation. It usually comes from confession, and the point is that it is a way of getting to know the true self on the inside. And we actually have cliches for that, but it's an aspect of human nature that's important and that all of us are familiar with. Well, writers can replicate that part of human nature by creating an outer mask for a character and then applying pressure to that character in such a way that the character is forced into a situation where the mask comes off. And then we feel intuitively that we're getting a truer glimpse of the person on the inside, and they become more real, more rounded. Journalists actually do this all the time. In fact, one of my favorite examples comes from H.L. Mencken, the Baltimore Sun writer from the early 20th century, best known for writing about the Scopes monkey trial and really mischaracterizing it. If you know the history of that, most of what he wrote was the narrative that he wrote was not really true. It was barely factual in a few areas and mostly narrative. But he is a great writer, and he talks about when he was a young cub reporter, this older reporter taking him aside and telling him, look, all the stuff you think you know about journalism, you need to forget there's only one thing that is necessary as a journalist, and that is to create a villain and then execute him in the public square. And Mencken says that he resisted this for a while. He didn't like it, But when he eventually gave into it and started doing it, he realized it's true. This is all we do in journalism. And he made a career out of not finding villains, creating villains, and executing them in the public square. And I would say that journalism hasn't really changed that much, regardless of which side of the political fence or fences you happen to be on. What you will often see today is people creating villains and then executing them in the public square. Well, that is the use of this technique, but I would say an unfair use of this technique. And that doesn't mean you can't do it fairly and do it well. So one thing to consider is that when you're creating a character, you're actually not creating a person, right? You're actually, at best, you're creating the footprint of a personality. And the way to do that is very simple. It's just a matter of telling the truth through self-revelation as a lens for their personality. And so what you do is you pair behavior with revelation. You start with the behavior, and then you reveal why the behavior is there, the real reason, not the apparent reason. You give an action first, and then you give us the reason or the cause for that action. You show us, put it simply, you show us the what before the why. And often there's a big gap. In a novel, the what of Chanticleer's snoring comes considerably before the why, many, many pages, hundreds of pages before the why of the thing. And that's important to understand, really. And it's not that difficult to do. It doesn't take a lot of time. What it takes is an understanding of your character and an interesting pairing of behavior and cause. So the last thing I want to point out about this is that graciousness of a character. It's not always about how corrupt everyone is, and that's one of the things that makes journalism feel like such a cynical thing, is that it tends to focus on the negative side. When we build people up, we enjoy as a culture, for some reason, like waiting for that person who's been built up and made into this icon or idol or whatever, waiting for them to fall. That's one of the hallmarks of journalism. But it's not a very, very nice one. As a person who believes that most people have a combination of good and bad in their inner selves, as a writer, what I like seeing and what I like reading is the truth behind a character, something that resonates, where I can say this person is a mixture of good and bad, and it's why journalism falls short so often, is that it's trying to be so compressed that it only focuses on one or the other. And so we only get this person's a marvelous, wonderful person and never does anything wrong, or this person is a terrible, horrible, Simon Bar Sinister. And the reality to all of us that we know intuitively is that all of us are a combination. And pulling the masks off in such a way that we see the good and the bad is really what makes writing great. So if you enjoyed this, I hope you check out our websites, clearwaterpress.com, and I'm going to do some more of these. And I hope you will enjoy the rest of the quarantine.